Thank you all, as Harish said, for braving the Monday morning traffic. It's such a pleasure to see so many faces here, both old friends and hopefully new ones. So, as Harish said, I'm a public historian. The work that I do really focuses on taking and distilling the insights of generations of scholars and weaving them into new kinds of narrative histories that bring to life the medieval world in all of its color and glamour. Um, what you can see here is a portion of the cover of my new book, Lords of Earth and Sea, A History of the Chola Empire. And as many of you may know, we don't actually have a lot of surviving artifacts from the Chola period, especially jewelry. Very often when it comes to medieval jewelry, it seems that they were melted down a few centuries after the initial production. So a lot of the gold and jewels that are still circulating in South India today might have slight grains of jewels that were produced many centuries ago. And I think this really exemplifies the many ways in which history continues to shape and influence the present. And I think that no dynasty really exemplifies this, not just in Tamil Nadu, but really in South India as large. No dynasty exemplifies this just as much as the Cholas do. I felt it was very important to talk in this book about the Cholas, not just in a state perspective, but really in a trans-regional perspective. So what the book offers is new insight into how the Cholas worked in South Karnataka, how the empire operated in Sri Lanka, and the various extraordinary innovations it introduced in South Indian statecraft, and the ways that it later influenced architecture and social and religious changes. Can we have the next slide, please, Harish? So what you'll see here is a recreation of a Chola Sengol, the royal scepter. And since, of course, there are no surviving Chola Sengols, we have to go by guesses from surviving artifacts, as well as a study of various Chola sculptures. So the little pommel that you see here with the two makaras consuming the warriors actually comes from a sculpture on the Vedishwara temple at Tanjore. And we try to speculate how this may have looked if rendered in jewelry. And all the patterns that you see on the shaft, if we can go to the next slide, please, Harish. All of these patterns also appear not just in Chola bronzes, but also in the murals of the Vedishwara temple. So, in a way, the cover is a metaphor for the broader project that I was trying to achieve with this book, is to take the evidence we have and use it to infuse life into this colorful and lost world. So, what exactly do I mean when I say the Chola world? I think that most of us are very familiar with these maps of medieval India that think of medieval states like modern states. Right? Today we think of nation states as these unitary and homogeneous units with clear boundaries, and the entire world essentially is divided into a jigsaw of states. Not a single bit of land is left unclaimed by a single state. But this was not the case for the polities of medieval India. Medieval Indian polities were a lot more heterogeneous, a lot more diffuse, and they were not uniform, nor did they have very clear boundaries. So these are kinds of maps that you will see throughout the book again and again. What you can see here is a depiction of the Chola kingdom in the 10th century, and you can see that while there is a core area around the Kaveri, you can see in the darkest grey there with a few cities. This Chola Nadu was the region that was most comprehensively controlled by the dynasty. But there were many polities, many independent powers or semi-independent powers, like village assemblies or autonomous Nadu assemblies that ruled multiple villages together and dealt with matters such as irrigation, taxation, judiciary, fairly independently. So it was very important for a medieval king, whether the Chola, the Pandya, the Pallava, to not only be able to project their military authority into these regions, but also to have these regions accept them as legitimate rulers. And the way that they managed to do this was partially through literature, but much more substantially through temple patronage. But the interesting thing about the early temple patronage of the Chola dynasty is that it's, according to the epigraphy at least, more often than the kings, it's the queens who are doing it. Can we go to the next slide, please, Harish? So what you see here on your left is the temple built by the Iroquois princess Nangai Bhuti Pidaraya at Tiruchendurai, which is a bit upriver from Srirangam. Most of us know history on Gomez, I'm sure. And the image that you see on the right is a temple built by her father, Bhuti Vikramakeshwari, at Kodumbalur in present-day Pudukottai district. Now, I'd like to point your attention to the bottom part of both of these temples. If you were to look at the basement of the mover coil, you will see that there is a row of carved lions, right? Then there's a rounded molding, and then right under that is this beautiful plinth of lotus petals that are depicted as though they're softly falling. Now, Nangai, who was the daughter of Bhuti Vikramakeshwari, was a Chola daughter-in-law. She was married to a Chola prince. And generally speaking, when we think about royal women in medieval India, we think of them primarily as wives, primarily as mothers. So the tendency really, and I think this is a result of British Orientalism, is to imagine queens lolling about in the women's quarters waiting for the king to rescue them or be used by them to appoint one or the other prince as the heir. But the reality of it is that you really have to think about the social backgrounds of these queens. Where are they coming from and what are they doing in the court? Well, Parantaka Chola, the most famous, I would think, of the early Chola kings and the great-grandfather of the much more famous Rajaraja Chola, Parantaka was married to 12 queens. And these ladies came from all the different kinds of power centers in the early Tamil plain. So they're coming from various Vellala gentry, so folks who own a little bit of land. They come from armed families like the Irukuvales, but they also come from more humble villages. But generally speaking, these are all intelligent and educated women. And intelligent and educated women, in my experience, and I'm sure the audience will agree, don't sit around waiting for their husbands to get them to do something. They have their own ideas about what they'd like to do with their careers. And you see this quite clearly with Nangai's temple, because she's not building in the Chola style. She's building a temple in the Irukkavale style, because once again, when you look at the bottom of this temple, you see the same features. You see the row of lions, you see the rounded molding under that, and it's not super visible in this photo, but take my word for it, there's also a plinth of lotus petals carved as though they're gently falling. And the really remarkable thing about these queens' temples is that you can use them to trace out not just their political affiliation to their home family, whose interests they are trying to promote within the umbrella of the Chola court. You also see solidarities and sisterhoods emerging in the court as queens borrow architectural ideas from each other. So you will see non-Irukavale queens also using the same kind of features. Non-Irukavale queens, sometimes we know of the mother-in-law of Nangai Bhuti, for example, commissioned a temple once again with a row of lions and the lotus plinth. So in contrast, I think, to the modern media idea of the combative Sas Bahu, instead you have a much more interesting situation where a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law are collaborating to independently promote their own interests. The next slide, please, Anish. Now, in this context, I want to talk to you about a woman who I think is one of the most important religious figures in Asian history, if not really in the history of the world, and that is Sembian Mahadevi. Now, Sembian Mahadevi is generally, I think she is known mostly in Tamil Nadu, but not really in North India, for example. But through her temple patronage, she completely changes not just the religious policy of the Chola family, but also reinvents the dynasty in a sense within the eyes of its very diverse medieval audience. And the way that Sembian Mahadevi does this is by constructing temples at a scale that had never been done before, either by any Chola king or any Chola queen. While most Chola queens in the generation before her commissioned one temple, and over the course of their lifetimes they would focus their attentions on a single temple, Sembian Mahadevi built 12 temples. And this image that you're seeing is from the very first temple that we know that she built, which is in Tirunallam, also known as Koneri Rajapuram, not too far away from Kumbakonam. And here you can see her husband, the late King Gandaraditya, is depicted worshipping, adoring a linga that is being garlanded by a priest. And behind him, you see the figure holding the umbrella. That's her son, King Uttama Chola, who has just been crowned. And it seems that Sembian Mahadevi had a sense that Uttama Chola, his position on the throne was not entirely secure in the early 970s. There was a whole bunch of family politics, which I don't want to get into right now. But what she says in his inscription is that this is a depiction of the glorious king Gandaraditya who is worshipping Shiva, and behind him is the glorious king Uttama Chola who is doing the same thing, and I'm the glorious queen Sembian Mahadevi who is commissioning this portrait. On the one hand, I'm pretty sure that Sembian herself was a devout lady, and very possibly that's what's being seen here. But there's also an understanding of the public relations aspect of temple building, because you have to keep in mind that most of the little villages of the Tamil plain could not afford to build in stone. Building in stone required you to have access to a quarry, it required you to have barges and boats and rafts to transport the stone, you had to be able to hire sculptors, you had to have project overseers to be working with them to execute projects like this. So most villages would have small temples of brick and timber. But Sembian Mahadevi is building in stone. She's building this lasting monument with her name imprinted on it, with her devotion imprinted on it. And while she starts off by building in the Chola's backyard in the Kaveri floodplain, she very quickly starts to move further north into Tondainadu, which is the northern frontier really around where present-day Chennai is. And by selecting the sites where she builds these temples, she builds them in the sites that are sung about by the great Bhakti poets, or she constructs them in market towns. So obviously people who are visiting these temples are seeing Sembian as this devout queen and then taking word of her to various other sites. And you see from the 980s, from the late 970s, early 980s, you have village assemblies clamoring to get gifts from the Chola queen. You see them executing her gifts, and most interestingly, you see them adopting the god that perhaps was most dear to Sembian Mahadevi's heart, and that is Nataraja. Now, Nataraja up to this point was known as this wild and powerful god of the swamp at Tillai, the mangrove swamp at Tillai, which is present-day Chidambaram. But there are very few sculptures of him in the Kaveri area. After Sembian Mahadevi's career, Nataraja is everywhere in Tamil Nadu, and he's seen not only as a powerful form of Shiva, but he's also seen as a form that's particularly associated with the Cholas. So very often you can see when a local assembly or a local village or a local military or judicial officer commissions a Nataraja bronze, these are usually people who have some kind of tie to the Chola court. So she effectively, over the course of 12 years, achieves what kings could not do in the last 150 years of the sword, simply by finding a more direct route and reinventing the king as the foremost devotee of Shiva, and therefore somebody who his subjects can more directly relate to without the need of intermediary aristocrats and families in between. Next slide, please. This, of course, is one of the first depictions of Nataraja in the Kaveri area. This is at Koneri Rajapuram, and you can see that Sembian essentially, because she commissioned so many sculptures of Nataraja, he was depicted in many ways before this. The iconography of him was being standardized, the idea that he should be depicted with his leg crossed over his body, that his hand should be held in this way. But it's really Sembian Mahadevi's sculptor's interpretation of Nataraja that is disseminated over the Kaveri area and then beyond, and then becomes the basis for the most iconic symbol of Hinduism today. Next slide, please, Girish. Now, what really changes? The kingdom that Sembian Mahadevi is a part of is a fairly modest polity. But in 985, when Arulmozhivarman, the future Raja Chola, becomes king, something really changes the nature of the Chola Empire. To understand this, we have to look at the broader political context within which Chola power was emerging. Up till this point, the dominant part of the subcontinent had been in the Deccan region, so the Rashtrakuta Empire. And it makes sense once you think a little bit about the geopolitics of India. Generally speaking, the most powerful kingdoms are the ones that can command the largest harvests. So of course they tend to be in the big river valleys. So it's the North Indian empires, the Mauryas, the Guptas, who control the Ganga Yamuna valley. Or it's the Deccan empires, the Marathas, but also earlier than them, the Rashtrakutas and Chalukyas, who are ruling the Krishna Godavari valley, who are like very powerful empires. The Kaveri, in comparison, while it is a strong and silty river, does not approach the scale of these huge river valleys. But what you can see here is essentially an empire of the coast, an entirely new kind of geopolitical formation that had not existed in India before this, that unites essentially the entire east coast and extends its sway into a good chunk of the west coast as well. But sometimes, just as the earlier Chola kingdom was, this later Chola empire is still a very heterogeneous entity. you can see that there's this huge core region that Rajaraja Chola is extracting taxes and manpower from. But there are also these vast frontiers among which this manpower is being dispersed for military expeditions. The northern part of the empire, extending into present-day Andhra Pradesh, is ruled by the Chalukyas of Vengi, who are puppet rulers controlled by Rajaraja. This entire Chera and Pandya region is a region of constant challenge for Rajaraja. There are many inscriptions where he talks about expeditions sent into Malay Nadu and the various treasures that were captured from the Chera and Pandya kings. And of course, in the far south, in the Tirunelveli region, and of course in northern Sri Lanka, there are more permanent Chola outposts, which was quite revolutionary for a medieval Indian state. Generally, when a medieval king went to war, they would go and beat up the bad guys, and then appoint a vassal from the same local dynasty to rule in their name. The Cholas don't do that. The Cholas kick out older dynasties and then put Chola princes with new titles into these regions. Can we go to the next slide, please? And just to give you a visual impression of the scale of the resources that Rajaraja Chola is able to command as a successful martial king, as well as a great devotee of Shiva, he's able to command essentially a twin engine state that can offer both successful military careers but also successful administrative careers to a vast number of people in the Tamil area. Now, the temple that you see right in the bottom there on the left is the Mover Koil, the very first temple that we saw. The kind of temple that was being built by important kings in the Kaveri area in the 10th century. And then you have the Rajarajeshwaram, the Bridishwara temple, which was built over the course of about 7 years in the early 11th century. And it was built, it consists of about 130,000 tons of granite, which means that at least about 7,000 tons will be moved every single year. And this is a speed of mobilization of resources, a speed of figuring out engineering solutions that Europe had no equivalent to for centuries after that. And of course, you can see a comparison of that in the Leaning Tower of Pisa, built many centuries later, which took generation after generation to complete, while the Rajarajeshwaram was completed over, once again, just 7 years. I must thank my friend Aurelia Frederick, she's there in the audience. Aurelia was the illustrator behind these extraordinary let's go to the next slide, please, Suresh. So, what was the nature of Chola conquest? Now, of course, it was very important. You see the Chola inscriptions. There's an emphasis really on the martial power of the king. And in Sri Lanka, this is a stupa from Anuradhapura, the former capital of Sri Lanka. And Rajaraja Chola, of course, claims that he took Anuradhapura quite violently. And the Sri Lankan sources also claim the exact same thing. So for the longest time, historians were convinced that two independent sources are agreeing on the same thing, so therefore it must be true. But archaeological excavations in Anuradhapura found that there is no evidence of mass destruction. So it seems that Rajaraja had an incentive to claim military conquest, the Lankans had an incentive to paint him as a conqueror, but the reality of it is that Anuradhapura was already in decline before the Cholas arrived. And the reason why Anuradhapura came to an end was because the Cholas set up a new city at Polonnaruwa, which is a different outpost, which then absorbed the manpower, the trading talent, and the merchants who once lived in Anuradhapura. So these medieval polities very often challenge our expectations of how the world worked. It's much more complex. You see people who are capable of spinning narratives, who are capable of doing things that really seem more reminiscent of contemporary politicians than you would otherwise think. Next slide, please. I just want to emphasize the amazing ability of these medieval folks to build images around themselves. Now, this is an inscription from the Bridishwara temple, and you can see the slew of extraordinary titles that Rajaraja Chola claims for himself. He calls himself the King of Kings, Lion among Kings, and his orders are to be cherished by the multitude of the diadems of the crowd of princes. And then there's a list of conquests that he provides before, and he claims a little earlier that he is no longer married simply to mortal women, he is the consort of goddesses. And he has this very interesting line at the very end where he says that after conquering all these places, he deprived the Pandyas of their splendor, and he was resplendent to such a degree that he was worthy to be worshipped everywhere. Now, what he's saying here, and this is a very interesting part of medieval culture and politics, in that kings, when they seized each other's treasuries, were also seizing each other's martial glory and absorbing them. So when he has conquered 8 different countries, when he has taken the treasuries of the Pandyas and the Cheras, Rajaraja seems to be saying that not only am I worthy to be a great conqueror, I am worthy to be followed, and my devotions to Shiva essentially make me, in a sense, semi-divine. And this might seem like a bit of a stretch, but when you look at the architecture, if you can go to the next slide, of the Brihadishwara temple, you begin to understand why Rajaraja may have had this political image of himself. Once again, thank you, Aurelia, for this magnificent illustration. It is so nice to be seeing it up on this giant screen, because you've just been staring at it on laptops and phones for the longest time. So what we've done here is we've taken architectural plans of the Brihadishwara temple. We have studied murals from within the Pradakshina Patha of the temple, and we've used that to guess at how the temple must have originally been intended. You will see that if you these little dome-shaped corners of the temple that you see, when you look at them closely today, you will see they're actually carved with brick tiles. They are meant to approximate roofs, and so obviously these must have been brick colored. And the murals suggest that temples at this time were generally plastered, while the sculptures were painted. And that allowed us to come to, and we also have this inscription from the temple itself that says that the shikhara, the very top, was gilded with bronze and gold. But aside from all of this, the really interesting thing is, if you were to look at the inscriptions and the rituals that are described for Shiva, reveal that the temple was built in the Shaiva Siddhanta, the Agamic tradition. And within the Shaiva Agamas, according to the great Tamil scholar R. Nagaswamy, a king who builds a temple like Meru, the cosmic world mountain, a king who builds a temple like Meru will remain like Shiva after his death. So while he does not become Shiva, he becomes a being who has been unfettered from the world by the generosity he has shown to Shiva and the grace of Shiva in return. So it seems that Rajaraja conceived the Brihadishwara temple as a great imperial center, where the devotion to Shiva was also merged with generosity to him. You can see so number 11, that's marked at the basement of the temple. Those are all the inscriptions, and they're pretty much at eye level. So as you're walking around the temple, you will be able to see all the gifts made by Rajaraja, as well as his army regiments, and the composition of the staff of the temple, which included people from all over the empire, and also rice was supposed to come to it from all over the empire. The scale of the gifts to the temple are absolutely mind-boggling. We're talking about 2 or 3 tons of gold. We're talking about 5,000 tons of rice that was supposed to be delivered to it every year. And 5,000 is just a number. The scale of it, let me give you an example. It would take 12 Airbus A380s to move 5,000 tons of rice. Now, whether all this actually reached the temple is up for debate, but the fact is that it was conceived at this colossal scale. There was very clearly this imperial attempt, this imperial objective to weave together many different polities, many different peoples, many different army units, governors, priests, all into one colossal project. And an imagination like this is entirely Rajaraja Cholas. You do not see any equivalent of this, any sustained and comprehensive imperial project like this anywhere else in medieval South India. Next slide, please. Now, Rajendra Chola, who is the successor of Rajaraja, is arguably more famous than his father in some ways for taking the empire to its territorial height. And nothing exemplifies this as well as his campaign to the Ganga to seize waters to bathe his new imperial temple. And as I was reading the inscriptions and I was thinking about military logistics from the rest of the medieval world, unfortunately we don't have palm leaf records where Cholas explained to us how they thought about feeding tens of thousands of men on the battlefield, but you've got to feed them. People are not going to march all the way to the Ganga if they're starving. So how did the Cholas manage to pull this off? Now I think that what the inscription suggests is that rather than marching all the way to the Ganga, I think that fleets of merchant vessels were accompanying the army as it moved north. And it was the merchants who were able to very quickly keep resupplying the army, that they probably established emporiums along the marching route of the army. And I suspect that a lot of important ports along the east coast today actually date back to this expedition, such as, for example, Vishakhapatnam, where we know that Vishakha is really the name of Skanda, Murugan. There must have been a Murugan temple in Vishakhapatnam at some point, possibly set up by merchants, which has since been submerged by sea levels. When my grandfather was the vice chancellor of Andhra University back in the 80s, he actually tried to get the navy to dive and find the ruins of this temple, but unfortunately did not succeed. So you will see that what we've done is we've actually drawn this campaign as partially proceeding over land, going all the way up to Vizag, and then to Mahendragiri, which is a hill that marks the border between present-day Andhra Pradesh and Odisha. And there we have an inscription from a Chola general, so we know that an army was there. But after that, I think that they actually began to experiment with putting their troops on ships and moving them to areas that were previously inaccessible. And very much the sense you get from the Chola inscriptions is that no other king even imagined that such a thing was possible. So they essentially took the kings of North India utterly and completely by surprise, managed to drive them away, and of course get their hands on the precious waters of the Ganga. Next slide, please. Now, something seems to happen. There's this idea seems to be planted in the minds of the Cholas in the 1020s, because now they have managed to pull off this expedition, this experiment in combined arms strategies. And so in 1025, 1026, they decide to try their luck on an even more distant rival, and that is the great Malay port of Kedah. And as I was researching this expedition, I found this fantastic work by Professor Arunachalam, formerly with the Maritime History Society of Bombay. What Professor Arunachalam did is he looked at Arabu Tamil manuscripts which were preserved in the Maldives, which seem to draw from the same seafaring tradition as what the Chola merchants must have used. And so we can make a pretty good guess at how this absolutely extraordinary overseas expedition was put together. Now, we know that there were various names for winds and currents that were maintained by navigators and passed down from father to son, from uncle to nephew. We know they used a moist ball of ash to measure the speed, so they just drop it into the ocean behind the ship, and by tracing out the dispersal of the ash in the wake of the ship, they'd be able to guess at how fast they were going. They would use a coconut shell which was punctured at the bottom, and they would put that in a bucket, and they would see how much time it took for the coconut shell to fill up. Because it would always take the same amount of time, that could be used to have a fairly regular sense of how much time was passing. They navigated using what we would call great circle navigation. So they would orient the ship at night based on the position of various stars. Interestingly enough, it turns out that the North Star was not visible from Tamil Nadu back in the 11th century. So instead they used Betelgeuse, they used, which of course has a Tamil name, and they also used the star of the Big Dipper to navigate. And the way they did it was this remarkably efficient little system where they essentially had a little wooden board with a hole and a knotted cord pulled through it. Now, the knot would give you the base of a triangle. Yeah? You know that this is a right angle. So simply by putting the knot in your mouth, holding the board here, and knowing this angle, you could figure out the angle here to the star. Does that make sense? It's a very simple system, and I'm sorry for making you guys do maths on a Monday morning. It's a very simple system, but it works. All you have to do, because if you look at the latitude of Kedah, it's pretty much on the same latitude as Trincomalee in Sri Lanka. So all you would have to do all the annual Tamil merchant fleet had to do was sail down the coast from Nagapattinam, which is a great Chola port, get onto the shore of Sri Lanka, take a turn at Trincomalee, jump onto the monsoon winds, and then use the winds to navigate and sail within just 2 weeks to the coast of Kedah. And once again, it seems that the Malays had no clue that such a thing was even possible. They knew that the merchants would come every year, but the only person who had the imagination to say, let's risk putting our soldiers on this and see what comes of it, was Rajendra Chola. Now, once again, there's this remarkably modern imagination, this idea that, hey, let's have a new kind of alliance, let's try and do things that haven't really been tried before. And it works. They managed to pull it off. I think that while Rajendra claims many conquests over the seas, Kedah almost certainly was a place that he definitely managed to raid. Let's go to the next slide, please. So, while I was looking for archaeological evidence of the Cholas overseas, I was quite surprised to find that there aren't any Chola inscriptions in Southeast Asia. But we do have inscriptions from Tamil merchant teams. And I think this supports my contention that it was very likely the merchants who played a big role in the moving of Chola troops to this part of the world. This is an inscription from 1080 from Barus. So Barus is, you can see there on the west coast of Sumatra. I put a little thumb tag there. Now here's an inscription from Barus, and it tells you the name of the merchant guild that commissioned this, and that may have been one of the big players in the Chola court. We, the 500 of 1,000 directions, the ANIRUDH, known in all countries and directions, have met in Varochu or Barus, alias Madangari Vallava Techu Viyakonta Pattanam, the town of those beloved by the war goddess Durga. So these aren't your merchants who are sitting around counting coins and making investments. These are merchants who are fighting. They're merchants who are warriors, who are beloved of a war goddess. They have decided various things for, and just look at the title of the first gentleman, Nagara Senapati, the general of the town, and Mavettu, very possibly the mahouts of the elephants. Each ship will pay such and such tax in the form of gold based on the price of camphor before they walk on essentially a carpet that was laid before the shops in the town. And so, etc., etc., we've ordered this carving. Do not forget charity, charity alone is friend. Now, this inscription is so fascinating for many, many reasons. But to me, the most interesting thing is that the price of camphor is mentioned. Camphor is not something that grows or used to grow in India naturally. But we have so many inscriptions talking about the offering of camphor to Shiva. So where was the camphor coming from? Sumatra. And it was being sourced by the agents of the Chola king who were the merchants. Now, if you look at the position of their ports, you see there's one called Kotachina on the east coast, on the the upper side of Sumatra. And then you have, thank you for that, Harish. And then you have Barus just below. And in between, you can see there's this ridge. It's not like super visible, but there's this ridge that is the highlands of Sumatra. And that is where you have the dense forests where camphor grows naturally, where camphor trees can be found. And it seems that the reason for establishing these ports on opposite sides is because instead of taking this long voyage around this marshy and dangerous coast, wow, that's a nice laser. Instead of taking this long and dangerous voyage along the coast where pirates might get at you, you can instead directly go to the highlands and transport your goods, like so. The reason why we know that this very likely happened is that because to this day, there are people in the highlands of Sumatra, a culture called the Karo culture, and the Karo have 200 Tamil loanwords in their vocabulary. This suggests a long and sustained interaction for centuries with Tamil merchants and priests, and these are not necessarily functioning under the orders of the Cholas. Instead, they're doing their own thing and supplying the demand for temple construction and those kinds of very powerful forces that have been unleashed by this tide of Chola conquest. And it is because of merchants like this, you see, over the centuries, they begin to expand further. So you find bronze Deepa Lakshmis here in Jambi, and we have hordes and hordes of Chola gold coins and copper coins found here in Palembang. And here is Java, and we know that in Java as well, Tamil merchants sometimes served as tax collectors, and it gets crazier and crazier over the centuries until we arrive at the next slide, please, Hamish. This absolutely insane sculpture. Now I know I'm saying it's insane, but you guys are probably not very impressed by it. But can anybody guess where this is from? China. China, yes. This is from Quanzhou on the east coast of China, on the shores of the East China Sea. And this is a sculpture that was commissioned by Tamil merchants who had a little community there. And here's the inscription that we found from the temple, where they tell you that in 1281 CE, so under the rule of the Mongols who had conquered China, Sambandha Perumal, who was the leader of the Tamil merchant group there, in accordance with the Farman, which is a Persian word, Farman, the written permission given by the Mongol Khan, he declares the installation of the god Thirukanishwaram Udayar. Now, if you look at the titles of the Chola temples you mentioned, I talked about Rajarajeshwaram, so the Ishwara of Rajaraja. The temple at Gangaikonda Cholapuram used to be called Gangaikonda Choleshwara, the Ishwara of Rajendra Chola. And here you have the Ishwaram of the Khan. And this sculpture was not made by Indian hands. If you look at there's quite a few of these surviving sculptures in this temple, and you see they have these beautiful scrolling cloud motifs. The way they render lions is more reminiscent of Mongol art than of South Indian art. They have elephants with ears like bats, so they have these like little perforations in them, which is not really how elephants look. So clearly there are Chinese artists who are working in a local stone, but to design schema and memories and ideas that this Tamil diaspora in the 13th century has of this very distant homeland. And why are there merchants who managed to reach all the way here? It is very clearly a result of Chola expansion, of Chola imagination. Now, there is so much more that could be said about the Cholas, so many more threads that I would love to unwind for you. But you've been such a patient audience, and Dr. Chalapati has been sitting there so patiently. So let's move to a conversation. Hopefully, you can have a Q&A after. Thank you.